Welcome, fellow humans, to the ever-deadly plains of Ea, because today we are talking about the 100 Kingdoms. That is a faction within the game Conquest, the last argument of kings. And one thing I will add right up top here, if you like this video and you're interested in this faction, please consider using my affiliate link in the description down below. It'll save you 10% on all purchases from Bellum, and it goes an immensely long way to supporting me, my wife, our cat, this channel, all of it. So thank you so much to all those folks who have already used that link. For those of you who are new to Conquest or this particular faction, the 100 Kingdoms are the base humans of the setting. They have not been manipulated on a genetic level like the Nords, nor were they an accidental creation like the Wadroon or the Dweghome. They present themselves as the classic Renaissance style of knights. You have men-at-arms and squires and spellcasters and so on. And so if you like those kinds of classic fantasy heroes, ordinary men and women facing unspeakable horrors, this is the faction for you. Now, I'm going to cover the sub-factions in more detail later on in a separate video, once we establish some foundational lore, but understand something very, very important up top here. As the humans of this setting, they likely have the most diverse range of motivations and influences leading them to war. This means we can have armies built around innumerable battles, with different goals and methods of war, and so this is truly an army that can be whatever you want it to be lore-wise. Everything from crusading zealots to a small local warlord using knights to defend his petty fiefdom, even spiritual successors to the near demigod-like legions that is a deep part of their cultural heritage. My point is, this is a monster of a faction with all the options that you have, and as a player, you can build a whole city around whatever interests you about them. But there is a ton more going on here than just copy-paste of Bretonnians of old, because this is a faction that is born from strife, and the many responses to those traumatic origins give us a vastly different kind of people. Now, up front, I want to say that the origins of humanity in the Conquest setting are deeply fascinating. They have a whole unique backstory. However, that is a story for a different video because it is utterly intertwined with a completely separate faction known as the Dominion. So rather than being a history of man, I want this to be a history of the 100 Kingdoms, picking up when humanity reaches that point. These are humans that ended up far from home as refugees plunged into a universe of horrors. Because the story of the 100 Kingdoms really begins as the remnants of humanity are fleeing the Dominion over the Clostrian mountains headed west to the Bitter Sea. Again, we're going to cover what brought humanity to that point in a dedicated video, but our heroes arrive ragged and worn from days of travel in panic. Now, this moment, their birth as a faction of the 100 Kingdoms, represents a massive reset button being pressed on society. Before, in the Dominion, they were very well established with a priesthood and political structure and all of those things, but it was all thrown in a blender. And when society moved over to their current location, it regressed. It went backwards to the most common form of power that there is, which is gangs and local warlords. Those refugees with the most coin or influence were able to stake a claim of land early on and band together a crude workforce and military arm, and so feudalism, in all of its primal glory, I guess we can call it, reigned for a very long time. And so this fractious nature is what led to the name the 100 Kingdoms, as in humanity in this region is composed of a whole bunch of these tiny pockets of feudal power, each a kingdom unto themselves. Now, I don't think 100 is an exact number, but you get the idea. They're just kind of stating there's a lot of us. And at this point, each kingdom wars against each other for land and workers and military rights and all these kinds of things, but they also have to defend themselves from stuff like the Spire and the Dweghome and Nord raids on the coast. Every one of these little kingdoms is an island unto themselves at this point. And the reason that they have all these threats around them is because, remember, they were refugees. They came into this land that have already had Dweghome towers existing for forever and spires and all these different Nord raids already coming down. Like, they just walked into the killing field, essentially. And so if they want the space, they need to carve it out for themselves too. But if there is one constant in life, it is change. And as the generations passed from these very crude, like I said, refugee-style clans and civilizations, these very individual little kingdoms began to evolve and work together more and more out of necessity for survival than anything else. And so once they started being able to function together as a team, then we saw significant social, adaptation. So things like trade routes, right? Political hierarchies, aristocracies, and so on. And soon enough, an excess in population gave rise to an entire new class of person, and that is the mercenary. Now, these individual little tiny warlords, they didn't have to capture workers or use farmers to defend their land. Now they could hire armies. And in return, these armies could work for a number of these minor warlords, and this was a major destabilization of power because now someone who has no army but lots of wealth can all of a sudden amass a huge martial force and go take on their competitors. In addition to that, now it means that the average person can strike out on their own and make a real bit of money without having to subjugate themselves below a warlord. They could work in trade, they could work as a warrior professionally, or anything like that. So society, like I said, it hit a reset button, but all of a sudden, okay, now the gears are turning. We're kind of like seeing history play itself out again in terms of how we evolve and grow and build upon systems that came before. But as much as things always change, there are plenty of people who hate that change, and what a great way to keep people in line, even if they don't work for a warlord, but religion. Strict, harsh, demanding religion. Now we're going to talk more about the actual sub-factions of faith here in tomorrow's video, but as a quick note to understand, the modern church within the 100 Kingdoms is an extremely powerful and divided faction. Some of these, rulers of their own little kingdom will wield religious faith and devotion as a weapon, while others see it more as a means of control and commerce. But no matter how sincere an adherent may be, there is no denying that the Theist Church, as it's called, is a powerful faction within the 100 Kingdoms simply because it supersedes petty boundaries. It can act as a back channel for these various kings, warlords, there's aristocracy members to work together, to unite and divide, all without having to declare a full war upon one another. And when the church does declare war on an outside force or internal rebellion, they can summon huge armies of faithful zealots from across all of the kingdoms and of course hire mercenaries to stomp out any and all resistance. Now, as I end all these videos, I always like to talk about why I think this is cool. And honestly, to be totally fair, there's not a ton of super extravagant fantasy when it comes to the foundation of the 100 Kingdoms. They do have a pretty fantastic origin before then, but like I said, it just requires its own video to talk about. But as far as the founding of this as a faction that you and I can engage with, well, functionally, you and I take the role as either a super general, or it could be one of the warlords of one of these 100 kingdoms, and we are essentially assembling a fighting army and going out and picking a fight with somebody else, whether it's another 100 Kingdoms player or any of the other factions. And for me, as a huge fan of history, I love this stuff. The move from feudalism to a more, I'm going to say, civil era, things don't feel particularly civil all the time, but you know what I mean, is deeply fascinating to me. The idea that the technology of roads and trade and all of a sudden this burgeoning middle class of people who are happy to sell themselves out as mercenaries changed the world in immense ways, and it condenses hundreds of years of change into 4 paragraphs, which for me is just yay. And what I like about it is their history, at least for the forming of the 100 Kingdoms, is very relatable. If you're looking for the humans of the fantasy setting and that's just what you identify with and that's what you like, absolutely, the 100 Kingdoms are a fantastic representation of what humans would be like if they were dropped into this hellscape where it's just a dude with a sword versus all kinds of T-Rexes and fire machines and flesh horrors and trolls and giants. That's just a few things from the various other factions that they have to deal with. I totally get why that's awesome. At the same time, hitting the reset button on society allows you and I to go in and you can just pick a part of the Parabellum map that they have on their main page and just be like, I want to really flesh out this part. And so you can really design your own little fiefdom, and you can kind of articulate why the forces of your army are coming together. You can deem, yourself to be affiliated with either the Theist or the Deist Church, which we'll talk about the differences tomorrow, but you can really flesh all of that lore out because they are such a versatile army with so many units to represent so many different things. And certainly compared to the other factions in the setting, nobody has nearly as much infighting. The Spires will conspire against one another because they all want to raise in stature, but they're all, for the most part, playing the same game. Sovereign's game, so to speak. But, when you look at the Dweghome, each hold is isolated, but they do have a structure within each one of them. The Nords are generally all on the same page because it's just survival of the clan over everything else. And so we look at this faction of humans, you have enough resources and time to fight amongst yourself. What a luxury that the other factions in this setting do not have. And if you just got it together and unified, they were unified at one point into one empire, but that crumbled and fell apart. Well, if you could do that again, you could really stake a claim and have very secure borders. You could do anything you wanted. But unfortunately, the fractious nature of mankind and how duplicitous we can be and how we are all out for our own self-interest a lot of the times, especially as, rulers of these minor little kingdoms, it leads to our own weakness. And so I thought this was a great snapshot of just what would it actually be like if humans were dropped into this setting, right? I mean, the 100 Kingdoms evolved the way that we evolved, in a societal way at least, and they continue to have the flaws that we have. And so again, if you're looking to identify with your fantasy, if you like humans in these settings, I think Parabellum did a great job and really kind of put them into the spotlight here between their origins with the Dominion, which of course I'm going to do a dedicated Dominion video, but also how they are attacked on all sides, inward and outward, from enemies at home and abroad. So friends, thank you all so much for watching this video. I'm going to follow up tomorrow by talking about the various sub-factions, which, starting with the 100 Kingdoms, it's such a huge army that it really does require breaking it down into those sub-factions to truly understand the different social influences and military influences that make them an interesting and compelling army to follow. So I do hope that you watch that video, and I will catch you there. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and happy wargaming.